Attendant yells at black woman for boarding early, didn't realize she owns the plane. It began like any other day at Dallas Love Field, with passengers scurrying across polished floors and the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the air. Yet, behind Gate 7, a fateful encounter was about to unfold, one so shocking, its echoes would reverberate far beyond the airport's walls. An attendant's raised voice shattered the usual airport hustle, aimed at a poised black woman who had dared to board a private Gulfstream G650 too early. Little did anyone know this was no ordinary passenger. Unbeknownst to the attendant, the woman owned the jet, and by the end of the day, shocking revelations would upend everyone's assumptions. Ebony Harrison woke to the electronic trill of her phone alarm at precisely 5:00 a.m. She rolled over in her plush, king-sized bed, blinking away the last vestiges of sleep. The Dallas skyline shimmered just beyond her floor-to-ceiling windows. Today was a day she had been anticipating for weeks. Her schedule included a short flight from Dallas Love Field to Los Angeles International Airport. Normally, she might have hopped onto one of her standard commercial flights. She had a membership that allowed her exclusive lounge access, priority boarding, and every possible comfort. But on this morning, Ebony planned to travel on her own plane, a sleek, custom-designed Gulfstream G650. She owned it outright, having invested part of her substantial fortune into both technology startups and the real estate market, culminating in enough wealth to purchase her own private jet. Outside her luxury high-rise, the city was already humming with life. Cars dotted the road, their headlights merging into streams of brightness under the early sun. Ebony pulled on a fitted navy blue dress, discreet but elegant, with a subtle gold pin on the collar, her grandmother's brooch, a cherished family heirloom. She'd learned many lessons in her life, and one of them was that appearances sometimes opened doors before you could speak a single word. However, Ebony was no longer in a position where she relied solely on appearances. Hard work, ingenious business decisions, and unwavering resolve had brought her to a place of financial independence and influence. She reflected on it with gratitude, determined to remain humble and gracious. Though Ebony didn't flaunt her wealth, she was used to courtesy and professionalism when she moved through airports, especially those handling private aviation. She cherished efficient travel experiences. This morning, her assistant had texted details about her flight crew, the expected departure time, and even the forecast in Los Angeles. It appeared to be an ordinary day, but Ebony had an unshakable feeling that something was looming over the horizon. Perhaps it was the anxious twist in her stomach, or the subtle tension in the city air. She told herself to ignore it, that the day's events would flow smoothly after all. She was simply traveling to finalize a partnership meeting in Los Angeles. On the drive to the airport, Ebony found herself drifting back to her childhood in a working-class Houston neighborhood. Growing up, she had loved watching planes take off from a distance, their metallic bodies glinting in the sun. Her mother had often sighed, reminding her that traveling by air was a luxury they could rarely afford. Ebony had vowed early on to change her life trajectory. "Things are going to be different for me," she remembered telling her best friend Carla when she was no more than 10 years old. Even as a child, Ebony sensed that the sky was not out of reach. Through scholarships, Ebony attended a top-tier university, pouring her soul into her studies. She endured countless sleepless nights, coding software prototypes in the computer lab, hustling to catch up on part-time jobs that often extended beyond midnight. All that hard work paid off. By age 25, Ebony was on Forbes' 30 Under 30 list for her pioneering work in artificial intelligence. Her software company was eventually purchased by a major tech conglomerate, leaving her with a windfall. That windfall would become the bedrock of her empire. Now in her early 30s, Ebony held multiple investments: commercial real estate in Houston, a minority stake in an international shipping firm, and a budding philanthropic foundation aimed at empowering underrepresented youth in STEM fields. Yet, even with all the accolades and business triumphs, Ebony couldn't escape moments of prejudice and discrimination. She had grown used to being one of the few black women in boardrooms. She'd been mistaken for interns, secretaries, or assistants on more occasions than she could count. Each time, she navigated these slights with dignity and grace. But every so often, an incident jolted her into recalling that no amount of success could completely shield her from discrimination. Still, Ebony refused to allow such negativity to define her. She reminded herself of the mantra her mother had often repeated: "You are as worthy as anyone else in this world." At Dallas Love Field, Ebony's driver maneuvered through to the private aviation terminal, a more discreet area than the main commercial terminals. The building had glass doors tinted for privacy, and a small sign welcomed passengers who came to fly via private charters or personal jets. Here, Ebony usually encountered a calmer, more refined atmosphere than the bustling main concourse. However, almost immediately upon entering, she noticed a subtle shift in the energy around her. A few people, mostly staff from the fixed base operator FBO, were gathered behind the counter. Conversations fell into a hush as she approached. Ebony had no illusions. She was used to being the only black woman in many such spaces, and it often elicited curiosity or silent stares. Nonetheless, Ebony lifted her chin, offered a polite smile, and strode to the check-in desk. A young man in a crisp uniform greeted her with a courteous nod and typed swiftly on his computer after she presented her identification. "Good morning, Miss Harrison," he said, double-checking the details on the screen. "Everything is in order. We have your flight plan filed and crew ready." Ebony's professional, calm demeanor remained unwavering. "Thank you. I believe we have a departure scheduled in about an hour." "Yes," the man replied. "Your pilot is Captain Jim Saunders, and your flight attendant is Harriet Barnes. They'll be with you momentarily." Relieved that everything was on track, Ebony thanked him again and wandered to the lounge area. Through the large picture windows, she could see her Gulfstream G650. The sun was glimmering against its sleek silver fuselage. The tail bore a discreet A insignia in a tasteful gold script, Ebony's personal mark. Witnessing the plane's elegant lines never failed to stir pride in her. She considered how many hours of negotiations, planning, and sleepless nights had gone into creating a business portfolio that allowed her such a privilege. As she waited, Ebony tapped through her emails, answered a few urgent messages, and took a final look at the notes for her upcoming meetings. Moments later, Captain Saunders, wearing his traditional pilot's cap, approached with a welcoming smile and handshake. He had flown Ebony many times, and always conveyed respect and gratitude to be part of her flights. "Pleasure to fly with you again, Miss Harrison," he said. "The pleasure is all mine, Captain. Ready when you are." Moments later, a tall, middle-aged woman strode into the lounge with an air of authority. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her uniform was pressed with impeccable neatness. In her hands, she clutched a clipboard. Ebony assumed this must be Harriet Barnes, her flight attendant. Captain Saunders introduced them. "Miss Harrison, this is Harriet Barnes, who'll be looking after you in the cabin today." Harriet's eyes flicked over Ebony, and her expression tightened fractionally. "Miss Harrison," she said, her tone polite but somewhat forced. "Looking forward to serving you." Ebony smiled, extending a hand. Harriet shook it with a perfunctory grip, then hurriedly pulled away. There was no overt rudeness yet, but Ebony sensed something guarded in Harriet's demeanor. Perhaps Harriet was new and simply nervous, Ebony thought. Flight attendants for private jets often prided themselves on white glove service, and some took their roles with a solemnity that bordered on severity. Still, Ebony's instincts told her something was off. She watched Harriet step aside and begin talking to the gate staff in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at Ebony. The looks Harriet gave her felt like question marks. Ebony tried to shrug it off. Maybe Harriet was just verifying final cabin details or communicating with another staff member about routine matters. Ebony checked her watch. They would begin boarding in about 20 minutes. Everything was on time and running smoothly. A text message from Ebony's assistant, Carla, pinged her phone. "We just got word your meeting in La might shift an hour earlier. Captain says plane is ready for early departure if needed. Let me know if that's what you want." Ebony exhaled thoughtfully. With an earlier departure, she could land in Los Angeles sooner, avoid some traffic, and maybe even prepare an additional hour for her meeting. She texted back to Carla, "That's perfect. Let's go for it." Captain Saunders was amenable. In private aviation, such flexibility was expected. So Ebony decided to board the plane earlier, ensuring they could secure a new flight clearance and depart within the next half hour. She approached Harriet, who was standing near the window scanning her clipboard. "Excuse me, Miss Barnes," Ebony said politely. "We're moving departure up slightly. Is it possible for me to go ahead and settle into the cabin?" Harriet's eyebrows arched slightly, and her eyes darted around as if checking if Ebony was talking to someone else. "You want to board now?" Her tone was laced with an unspoken challenge. Ebony found it slightly odd. Was Harriet not informed about the new plan? "Yes, if that's all right. Captain Saunders said we can shift departure. I just want to be in place so as not to delay anything." With an exasperated sigh, Harriet looked Ebony up and down. "Are you sure you're on the correct flight? I'm not sure that's authorized." Ebony blinked, her composure shaken for a moment. "I'm quite sure. This is the Gulfstream G650 with tail number NEH 650. The plane belongs to me." Harriet pursed her lips, and rather than acknowledging Ebony's claim, she offered a dismissive, "Please wait here while I confirm." Before Ebony could respond, Harriet marched over to the gate agent and launched into a whispered conversation. Their eyes occasionally flicked over to Ebony, and Ebony felt the all-too-familiar pang of suspicion. The gate agent repeatedly nodded, as though trying to gently reassure Harriet about something. Finally, Harriet turned around, approaching Ebony briskly. "You're Miss Harrison?" Harriet asked, as if Ebony hadn't already introduced herself. "Yes, Ebony Harrison," Ebony responded calmly, though her patience was wearing thin. Harriet rechecked her clipboard, muttering under her breath, "Okay, so you're the VIP, right. Let's get you on board." No apology, no courtesy, just a vaguely begrudging compliance. Still, Ebony followed Harriet through the terminal's private corridor, stepping out onto the tarmac. The morning sun cast long shadows, and Ebony felt that same nagging tension in the air. Something was not right. She could sense Harriet's reluctance, even as the flight attendant led her up the jet's air stairs. Inside the cabin, Ebony inhaled the cool, climate-controlled air, scented with subtle notes of leather upholstery and the faint whiff of jet fuel from outside. Normally, stepping into her personal aircraft brought an instant sense of comfort and pride. The cabin's design reflected Ebony's understated taste cream-colored leather seats, walnut veneer tables, and warm LED lights concealed behind elegant paneling. Harriet motioned for Ebony to take a seat near the front lounge area, her expression still unreadable. "I'll bring you a pre-flight beverage soon," she said curtly. "Thank you," Ebony replied, quietly seating herself. She placed her purse beside her and pulled out her tablet to finalize some details. The plane was empty aside from a co-pilot somewhere in the cockpit. Ebony usually flew with a small crew, the pilot, the co-pilot, and the flight attendant. They were normally people she'd worked with on multiple occasions. But Harriet was new to Ebony's team, apparently assigned by the FBO's staff rotation. As Ebony buckled into the plush seat, Harriet returned with a glass of water, garnished with a lemon wedge. She set it down on the side table with no more than a minimal glance in Ebony's direction. Ebony offered a grateful nod. Harriet, however, didn't linger, turning abruptly and heading to the galley, presumably to prep the cabin for departure. Moments later, Ebony heard Harriet's voice pitched, slightly louder than normal, speaking into the intercom or phone system used to communicate with ground staff. Ebony wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but Harriet's words echoed in the still cabin. "I've got a passenger already seated, but I can't confirm if she's supposed to be on board this early. Yes, I know it's her name on the flight manifest, but are you absolutely sure?" "No, I understand. Fine." Over and out. Harriet emerged from the galley, her posture rigid. Ebony decided to address the tension directly. "Is everything all right, Miss Barnes?" Harriet stared at her, her lips tightening. "It's just protocol. We're not used to passengers deciding to board earlier than planned. There are security procedures. I have to ensure everything is in order." Ebony fought the urge to let her frustration surface. She reminded herself to maintain composure. "I respect that. Just so you know, Captain Saunders and the gate staff confirmed the new departure time. If there's anything else you need from me, do let me know." Harriet stared a moment longer, then nodded once, spun around, and disappeared back into the galley. Ebony's gut told her this flight would be fraught with discomfort if Harriet didn't lighten up. Still, Ebony tried to refocus on her work. She turned on her tablet, reviewing a data analysis for the upcoming meeting, determined not to let Harriet's strange behavior derail her focus. A few minutes later, Ebony decided to step back off the plane to stretch her legs and speak with Captain Saunders about a detail in the flight plan. She unbuckled her seatbelt and headed towards the airstairs, stepping out into the morning sun. The hustle on the tarmac was picking up, with baggage handlers zipping around in carts and ground crew wearing neon vests, giving directions for departing jets. She was halfway down the steps when she heard a shout from behind. "You're not supposed to be leaving the plane right now!" Ebony paused mid-step. Turning around, she saw Harriet leaning out of the plane's doorway, eyes flashing with annoyance. Harriet's voice had cut across the tarmac, loud enough for several ground staff to glance over. Ebony climbed back up a step or two, confusion evident on her face. "I'm just going to speak with Captain Saunders. Is something the matter?" Ebony asked calmly, though her heart pounded at Harriet's accusatory tone. Harriet stepped onto the top stair, blocking Ebony's path. She lowered her voice, but kept an edge of indignation. "Passengers are not allowed to wander around on the tarmac unsupervised. We have strict rules. You could be trespassing on restricted grounds." Ebony squared her shoulders, forcing a polite smile. "Miss Barnes, I assure you, I have the clearance to be here. This is my plane, and I want to double-check details with my pilot." Harriet rolled her eyes, releasing a barely audible scoff. For Ebony, it was the scoff that finally snapped her patience. The condescension was blatant, as though Harriet couldn't comprehend Ebony's ownership of the jet. Nevertheless, Ebony refused to raise her voice. She kept her tone measured. "Excuse me, but this plane belongs to me. If you have security concerns, you can address them with the flight crew or the FBO manager. Now, if you'll move aside, I would like to speak to Captain Saunders." Harriet's face colored. She stood firm, as if challenging Ebony. "MAAM, with all due respect, is there a problem here?" Captain Saunders' voice intruded as he appeared at the bottom of the steps, glancing up at the standoff with concern. Harriet spun around. "Captain, this passenger, she's trying to." Captain Saunders' eyebrows shot up. "Miss Harrison is the owner of this aircraft." "Harriet," he said quietly but firmly, She can board and disembark as she pleases, provided it's safe to do so. Harriet looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. She gaped at the captain, then at Ebony, as if trying to reconcile these facts. But why wasn't I told that she was? Captain Saunders gave her a tight smile. We briefed you, Harriet. It's on your manifest. Miss Harrison is the principal of this flight. If she has business on the tarmac, that is within her purview, so long as ground control is informed. Ebony's cheeks were warm, though she resisted letting Harriet see the hurt that simmered beneath her composure. I simply need a word with you about the final changes to the flight plan, Captain. May I come down now? Harriet, flustered, stepped aside, and Ebony continued down the steps to meet Captain Saunders. She could feel Harriet's glare boring into her back as she walked. Once Ebony and the captain were a few paces away, Harriet disappeared back into the cabin. Ebony exhaled shakily. Apologies for that, Captain Saunders murmured. I've never worked with Harriet before. She's a last-minute substitute. If you like, we can contact the FBO and request a change in flight attendants. Ebony considered it, but there wasn't much time to arrange new crew. The earlier departure meant they would be taking off soon. Let's just get to LAA as smoothly as possible. Ebony sighed. We'll deal with any necessary changes once we land. Captain Saunders nodded, offering a reassuring smile. They clarified the final flight plans, focusing on the positive. With the updated departure, Ebony would reach Los Angeles earlier, giving her extra time to prepare for her meeting. Once they were done, Ebony reboarded. She maintained a polite distance from Harriet, determined to keep interactions civil and minimal. 40 minutes later, the Gulf Stream soared into the sky. Ebony fastened her seatbelt during takeoff, and once the plane reached cruising altitude, she settled into her routine, a glass of tea, some light reading, and a quick review of documents. At first, Harriet's presence was barely noticeable. She did a quick safety demonstration, offered Ebony a beverage, then retreated to the galley. Ebony felt some relief that Harriet seemed to have calmed down, but the respite was short-lived. Not long into the flight, Ebony heard Harriet rustling behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see Harriet fiddling with a cabinet that contained Ebony's personal items, extra blankets, a favorite pillow, some personal grooming articles. Need something? Ebony asked politely. Harriet turned, eyes narrowing. I'm just checking the supplies, making sure everything is up to par. This flight's supplies are somewhat extravagant. The subtext in Harriet's words was clear to Ebony. The older woman seemed to take issue with the standard of Ebony's accommodations. Ebony ignored the undertone and returned to her tablet. Harriet, however, lingered. You know, Harriet began, voice tinged with both curiosity and disbelief, I've flown with plenty of high-profile people, CEOs, celebrities, even royalty. But I've never heard of Ebony Harrison. Ebony met Harriet's gaze calmly. She was not in the habit of bragging about her achievements to quell someone else's doubts, nor did she have the slightest inclination to do so. That's understandable, Ebony replied. I'm not a household name. I run businesses. My work is mostly behind the scenes. Harriet folded her arms. What exactly do you do that you can afford a plane like this? Ebony froze. The question was intrusive in tone, borderline disrespectful. She reminded herself that Harriet was staff, albeit staff with a duty to attend to Ebony's needs during the flight. Still, Ebony knew that no flight attendant had the right to interrogate her about her personal finances. I'm an entrepreneur, Ebony said quietly, hoping the conversation would end there. Harriet's brows rose, unimpressed. Right. Ebony felt a rush of anger rising. It wasn't the words so much as the condescending tone, the suggestion that Ebony's success was implausible or suspicious. She took a deep breath, deciding to address Harriet's behavior head-on. Miss Barnes, I'm sensing some discomfort on your part. If you'd like to discuss any concerns about this flight or me personally, I suggest we do it in a professional manner. Otherwise, I have work to attend to. Harriet's lips tightened. She stared at Ebony for a few seconds, as though searching for a retort. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked back to the galley. Ebony released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, heart pounding at the sheer tension in the air. Some time passed, and Ebony tried to immerse herself in her work. Yet every few minutes, she sensed Harriet moving about the cabin, tidying things that didn't need tidying or checking overhead compartments that were already closed. Ebony felt like a specimen under scrutiny. Eventually, Ebony's phone buzzed. She had a signal through the plane's onboard Wi-Fi. Carla's name popped up on the screen, and Ebony quickly answered. "Hey, Ebony," Carla said, voice crackling slightly over the connection. "I've been trying to finalize your itinerary for LA. Are you all right? You sound tense." Ebony glanced over her shoulder, spotting Harriet hovering near the cabin door. She lowered her voice. "Everything's fine, just an unexpected bit of friction with the flight attendant." "Oh, the new one, Harriet. The FBO sent me her resume. She's supposed to have a lot of experience. She might, but let's just say it's not going smoothly. She seems to have trouble believing I own the plane. Lots of suspicious questions." Carla sighed. "I am so sorry you have to deal with that. Let me know if you want me to file any complaints." Ebony hesitated. She didn't like the idea of potentially jeopardizing Harriet's job without first giving her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Harriet was having a bad day, or maybe Ebony was misreading the situation. But Harriet's hostility was mounting, and Ebony wasn't one to overlook blatant disrespect. "I'll handle it," Ebony said diplomatically. "But keep your phone on. If things get worse, I might need you to speak with the FBO or escalate to the owners of the private terminal. They know me well." "Absolutely," Carla said. "Stay calm, Ebony. Don't let this ruin your day. You're a powerhouse, remember?" Ebony smiled at Carla's encouragement. They ended the call, and Ebony steeled herself for the remainder of the flight, determined to handle Harriet's hostility with her characteristic poise. A few hours into the flight, the plane entered a region of mild turbulence over New Mexico. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Ebony dutifully complied, fastening the belt around her waist. Harriet reappeared, checking that items were secured. This was standard procedure, yet Ebony couldn't shake the feeling that Harriet took extra care to be gruff while doing so. A sudden jolt rocked the cabin, causing Ebony to grip the armrests. Harriet stumbled slightly, muttering a curse under her breath, then grabbed hold of a seat for support. The flight deck announced that the turbulence would last about 15 minutes. Ebony tried to distract herself by looking out the window. She had grown accustomed to mild turbulence, but the tension in the cabin made it worse. Harriet, apparently looking for something to do, began rummaging through the overhead storage above Ebony's seat. "Everything all right?" Ebony asked warily. "I need to check these compartments," Harriet replied curtly. "They were checked before takeoff," Ebony reminded gently, "and they've been closed the entire flight." Harriet refused to meet Ebony's eyes. "We have protocols for turbulence. We must ensure no loose items are in the overhead bins." Ebony raised an eyebrow. She had never known a flight attendant to check overhead compartments mid-turbulence unless there was a specific reason. The plane lurched again. Harriet lost her balance momentarily, a look of frustration crossing her features. "This is ridiculous," Harriet muttered under her breath. "People thinking they own everything just because they paid a bit of money." Ebony's heart skipped a beat. The comment wasn't entirely audible, but the gist was clear. She wanted to respond, but decided not to incite further argument in the middle of turbulence. Instead, she kept her focus on breathing steadily, ignoring Harriet's pointed remarks. Finally, the turbulence passed. Harriet closed the compartment with a snap and headed back to the galley without a backward glance. When the sky had calmed, Ebony decided it was time to confront Harriet properly about her behavior. She unbuckled her seatbelt and walked to the galley, determined to have a civil conversation. She found Harriet leaning against the counter, arms crossed, staring out the small cabin window. Ebony cleared her throat softly. "Miss Barnes, may I speak with you for a moment?" Harriet turned, her gaze cold. "What is it?" Ebony forced a calm smile. "I understand you have protocols and responsibilities, but I feel there's been a lot of tension. I'd like us to clear the air. Is there something bothering you about this flight or about me personally? I'd like to address it so we can both have a more pleasant journey." Harriet's eyes flicked over Ebony. "You want honesty." "Yes, I'd appreciate that," Ebony said gently. Harriet exhaled, seemingly wrestling with her words. Finally, she spoke. "It's just I've been a flight attendant for over 20 years. I've served on many private jets, corporate charters, even the occasional flight for royal families. I've seen trust fund babies, arms dealers, shady crypto barons, and everything in between. But I've never heard of you, and I find it suspicious." Ebony's spine stiffened. "Suspicious in what way?" "Look, I know it's none of my business," Harriet continued, her voice low and intense. "But usually if someone owns a plane like this Gulfstream G650, they're either extremely famous or so wealthy their names show up in certain circles. When I got the assignment, I tried to look you up quickly. I didn't find much, just a few news articles about a software startup." Ebony folded her arms. "So because you haven't heard of me, you assume I'm not legitimate?" Harriet shrugged. "I see a lot of people who claim to be something they're not. Sometimes they're renting the jet or trying to pass off a sponsor's plane as theirs. It's not uncommon. I just don't see how someone like you could." Ebony bristled. "Someone like me?" Harriet's mouth pressed into a line. "You know what I mean. A woman so young, with no real public acclaim, and a black woman at that." Silence fell between them. Ebony's head pounded with disbelief and anger. She couldn't recall a time she had encountered such blatant ignorance from someone in a professional capacity. She forced herself to remain composed. "Let me be very clear," Ebony said, her voice quiet but firm. "I built a business, sold it for a substantial sum, and invested wisely. I am the sole owner of this plane. I have the paperwork to prove it if you'd like to see it, but I really shouldn't have to justify my accomplishments to my flight attendant." Harriet's face flushed. She looked away, arms still crossed. "You have your reasons for secrecy. Some people do. Maybe I overstepped." Ebony nodded. "Yes, you did. You overstepped. My suggestion is that we proceed with this flight in a professional manner. If you can't do that, I'll have no choice but to file a complaint with the FBO and request another flight attendant on future flights." "Fine," Harriet snapped. "Let's just get this flight over with." Ebony returned to her seat, shaking from the confrontation. She tried to quell the swirl of emotions, anger, hurt, disbelief. To cope, she turned up the soothing music in her headset, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. Minutes later, Harriet quietly passed by and placed a warm towel and a small tray of pastries on the table near Ebony without saying a word. Perhaps it was Harriet's attempt at an olive branch. Ebony acknowledged it with a nod. Harriet hovered a moment before retreating back to the galley. Ebony sensed Harriet might be feeling some guilt, but Ebony found it hard to forgive so quickly. Such a blatant display of prejudice had wounded her deeply. She reminded herself, though, that everyone came with their biases, some more harmful than others. It wasn't Ebony's job to correct them all, but she also wouldn't let such treatment slide. Events took an unexpected turn about half an hour later. Ebony had returned to reviewing documents on her tablet when Harriet dashed into the cabin from the cockpit area, her face ashen. "What's wrong?" Ebony asked, instinctively concerned. Harriet looked as though she'd seen a ghost. The cockpit is receiving an error alert about one of the engines. The captain is handling it, but we might need to divert. Ebony's stomach twisted. Mechanical issues mid-flight were never good. Harriet swallowed hard, pressing her lips together in a nervous line. I'm sorry for earlier, Harriet managed, glancing at Ebony. I just wanted you to know that. Ebony's anger froze, replaced by sudden alarm. She unbuckled, standing. Is it serious? Should I speak to the captain? He said we'll be all right, but we might land in Phoenix if the error code doesn't clear. Ebony nodded, trying to remain calm. She considered Harriet's apology, still reeling from the possibility of a forced landing. Let's focus on safety first. Thank you for telling me. It struck Ebony as ironic that Harriet's hostility had softened in the face of a potential emergency. Harriet's attitude might have been shaped by prejudice or preconceived notions, but in a crisis, the reality was that they were all in the same metal tube, thousands of feet above the ground. Hierarchies and biases tended to crumble under the weight of genuine fear. Captain Saunders soon made an announcement over the power system, explaining that one of the engine sensors had given a false reading. The plane was safe to continue, but they would divert to Phoenix for a quick check to ensure all systems were in perfect working order before proceeding to Los Angeles. Ebony was relieved it wasn't an immediate danger. Still, the day's stress mounted. The Gulfstream landed smoothly at Phoenix Sky Harbor's private terminal. Mechanics and ground crew greeted the plane. Ebony unbuckled and gathered her belongings. Harriet avoided eye contact, focusing on assisting the crew who boarded to run diagnostics on the engine sensor. Captain Saunders joined Ebony in the cabin, giving her an apologetic smile. We'll have a short layover while they check the sensor. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Harrison. Safety first, Ebony replied, mustering a smile. I'd rather land here than risk anything. As Ebony and the captain spoke, Harriet lingered nearby, fidgeting with her clipboard. Ebony caught Harriet's eye, and Harriet cleared her throat. Yes? Ebony asked. Harriet's expression was a mix of discomfort and genuine remorse. I'm sorry to intrude, but I wanted to sincerely apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and rooted in assumptions I had no right to make. Ebony studied Harriet's face, searching for sincerity. I appreciate the apology, Ebony said slowly. We all have biases, Miss Barnes, but I hope you understand how hurtful it is to be treated with suspicion or disbelief, especially based on appearance or race. Harriet nodded, shamefaced. I do, and I've been trying to reflect on why I reacted that way, I think. In my years of service, I've seen so many people flaunt wealth, treat flight staff like servants, or lie about who they are. I might have let that resentment build, but that's no excuse. Ebony took a breath, deciding to meet Harriet halfway. The day had been turbulent enough, and Ebony valued second chances when she sensed genuine regret. Thank you for recognizing that. I accept your apology. A moment of silence passed between them, laden with the complexity of prejudice, apology, and the subtle hope of reconciliation. The plane's engine check took about an hour. Ebony used the time to stretch her legs in the small lounge area of Phoenix FBO. She drank water, tried to ground herself, and conversed briefly with Carla on the phone to update her. Harriet was in and out, assisting the ground mechanics and checking on Ebony. Though Ebony's guard remained up, Harriet's demeanor was drastically changed, calmer, more respectful, more professional. Eventually, the mechanics cleared the plane. The sensor error was indeed a minor glitch, not indicative of any real mechanical failure. With clearance from air traffic control, Ebony's flight was back on track to Los Angeles. As the plane soared once again, Ebony felt the tension in the cabin dissipate slightly. Harriet approached with a tray, offering Ebony her choice of fruit and cheese, as well as a fresh glass of water. Miss Harrison, Would you like anything else to make the journey more comfortable? Harriet asked, voice softer than before. Ebony considered Harriet's sudden shift. Though Ebony had every right to remain cold, she opted for cordiality. No, thank you. This is fine, she paused. I appreciate you checking in. Harriet's eyes flickered with relief. Of course. Just let me know if you need anything. Shortly after, Captain Saunders announced they would land in Los Angeles in about 50 minutes. Ebony exhaled, thankful the flight was nearly over. She kept her eyes on the horizon. The day had been draining, emotionally and mentally, yet there was a faint sense of victory in knowing she had stood up for herself. Harriet's change in attitude was a small but meaningful win. The Gulfstream landed smoothly at LAX's private terminal, where Ebony's car service awaited on the tarmac. As soon as the plane's door opened, warm California sunshine spilled into the cabin. Ebony gathered her purse and business documents, taking one last look around to ensure she hadn't forgotten anything. Harriet stood by the exit. When Ebony stepped forward, Harriet gave a respectful incline of her head. Thank you for flying today, Miss Harrison. I truly am sorry for earlier. Ebony met her gaze, apology accepted. I hope we can start fresh if we cross paths again. Harriet nodded, relief evident in her eyes. Ebony offered a polite smile and descended the air stairs. As she climbed into the waiting car, Ebony felt a wave of gratitude for the chance to put the ordeal behind her and focus on her upcoming business meeting. The city of Los Angeles sprawled out before her, a tapestry of shimmering skyscrapers and palm-fringed boulevards. Today's events had been a test of patience and dignity, one she felt she had passed, if only by grace. Ebony's day progressed in a blur of high-profile discussions. She negotiated an impressive deal for her philanthropic foundation, forging alliances with major tech players to fund STEM scholarships. Exhausted but satisfied, she returned to her Los Angeles condo late that evening. She sank into a white leather couch, flipping through her phone messages. One caught her eye, Ebony. You won't believe this. The flight attendant from today, Harriet Barnes, had a meltdown at the FBO. She's been suspended. Call me when you can. Carla Ebony frowned. Suspended? She immediately called Carla. Carla answered, her voice vibrating with urgency. You remember Harriet? After you left LAX, she apparently got into a heated argument with another flight's passengers. Something about them not belonging on the plane. It escalated. The FBO management intervened, realized there had been multiple complaints against her over the past months. They suspended her pending an investigation. Ebony's jaw tensed. Harriet's prejudice wasn't a one-time occurrence. Ebony felt a pang of compassion. Clearly, Harriet was struggling with deeper biases, but Ebony also recognized the necessity of accountability. People who mistreated passengers, especially based on race or assumptions, shouldn't be representing a high-end flight service. Wow, Ebony said quietly. I wish it hadn't come to this. But she brought it on herself. Carla sighed. She did. Hard karma, I guess. By the way, the FBO manager, Richard Stanton, wanted me to tell you personally that they're sorry for your experience, and that Harriet won't be assigned to you again, ever. Ebony appreciated the gesture of apology, though it couldn't fully erase the sting of Harriet's earlier behavior. She thanked Carla and ended the call, staring out the window. The neon glow of LA twinkled below her. Ebony thought about Harriet, about how bitterness and prejudice could poison a person's interactions, leading them to sabotage their own career. Ebony felt a tinge of sadness, but she also felt relieved that Harriet's behavior had been called out, preventing potential future incidents. In the days that followed, Ebony tried to put the incident behind her, immersing herself in business and philanthropy. Yet Harriet's words lingered in Ebony's mind, reminding her that prejudice still existed in corners she least expected. Ebony was grateful that she'd stood her ground and spoken up. 2 weeks later, Ebony received a formal letter of apology from the FBO, along with a promise of improved training for their staff. The manager invited Ebony to personally contribute suggestions to the new training program focusing on diversity, respect, and inclusion. Ebony accepted, believing it was a worthwhile cause. She spent time crafting a module on unconscious bias, referencing real-life incidents without naming Harriet specifically, but pointing out how harmful unchecked assumptions could be. In some ways, Harriet's meltdown became a catalyst for positive change. The FBO instituted more robust sensitivity training, ensuring that staff would no longer be able to mistreat passengers who didn't look the part. Ebony's plane trips henceforth were smoother, staffed by attendants who treated her with the respect and courtesy due to any paying client, especially one who owned the aircraft. As life moved on, Ebony almost forgot about Harriet until a month later, when her assistant Carla forwarded an email with an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "A personal message to Miss Ebony Harrison." It was from Harriet. Ebony hesitated before reading, but curiosity prevailed. Harriet's email explained that she had attended mandatory counseling sessions and training after her suspension. She confessed that she had harbored resentment and prejudice for years, and she recounted her childhood experiences growing up in a racially divided environment, hearing stereotypes reinforced by family, and never questioning them. Harriet acknowledged that she had let those ingrained biases dictate her treatment of people who didn't fit her narrow worldview. She apologized yet again to Ebony, stating that she now recognized how wrong she had been and that she deeply regretted her actions. She thanked Ebony for not filing a personal lawsuit or pushing for her immediate termination, noting that it gave her a chance to reflect and learn. Ebony read the email twice, tears threatening to spill. She was moved by Harriet's vulnerability. Ebony believed in the possibility of redemption and the power of education to dismantle prejudice. She penned a thoughtful reply, offering Harriet words of encouragement and expressing hope that her journey toward a more open mind would continue. Ebony also urged Harriet to embrace diversity training wholeheartedly, not just as a condition of her job, but as a path to personal growth. 6 months passed. Ebony's philanthropic work prospered, with her foundation funding numerous educational programs. She traveled frequently across the country to speak at universities and corporations. One sunny afternoon, she found herself back at Dallas Love Field, heading to her Gulfstream G650 for another flight to Los Angeles. She learned from the FBO staff that Harriet Barnes had indeed been reinstated after meeting all the requirements placed upon her, though Ebony was assured she would not be assigned as Ebony's attendant again unless Ebony explicitly agreed. One day, Ebony noticed Harriet in the distance, working at the far end of the private terminal. Harriet glanced up, their eyes meeting. Ebony gave a polite, acknowledging nod. Harriet smiled hesitantly, offering a small wave. In that quiet moment, Ebony saw genuine remorse and the faint glimmer of gratitude. They didn't speak, but the tension that once hung heavy between them seemed replaced by a tentative mutual respect. Years down the line, the story of Ebony Harrison, the black woman who owned a Gulfstream G650, became somewhat of a legend in certain aviation circles. Some staff recounted how Ebony's quiet determination and calm dignity had spurred changes in training protocols and attitudes at one of the region's busiest private terminals. For Ebony, the incident with Harriet Barnes was both painful and illuminating. It underscored that success doesn't grant immunity from racism or prejudice, but it also highlighted how standing up for oneself could spark broader social change. Ebony's philanthropic programs expanded, and she became more vocal about inclusivity, inspiring countless young people from marginalized backgrounds to shoot for the skies, quite literally in some cases, as her foundation began offering flight scholarships as well. Harriet's life also changed. Freed from her job for a time, forced into introspection, she emerged with a deeper awareness of her biases. Though she stumbled, Harriet used the experience to reshape her outlook. She became an advocate for respectful passenger treatment, speaking to new flight attendants about the importance of empathy and the pitfalls of snap judgments. Stories circulated about how Harriet often recounted her own mistakes as a cautionary tale. Gradually, Harriet rebuilt her reputation, though the early tarnish would never fully fade. In the end, Ebony and Harriet's paths crossed only occasionally fleeting moments of recognition in the corridors of FBOs. But the legacy of that dramatic flight remained: Ebony's unwavering insistence on dignity, Harriet's transformation born of consequence and remorse, and the ripple effect across an industry that realized, even in exclusive spaces, prejudice could and must be confronted. The day Ebony boarded her jet, only to be yelled at for arriving too early, revealed more than one woman's plight. It showcased the power of owning one's story, speaking one's truth, and not shrinking in the face of bigotry. It demonstrated that even the most unexpected individuals, like Harriet Barnes, a flight attendant with decades of service, could unlearn hatred if faced with the cost of preserving it. And, most of all, it served as a reminder that none of us truly know the paths others have walked or the heights they've reached until we open our minds to see them as they are. And so, what began as a day of unexpected confrontation evolved into a turning point for Ebony Harrison. It underscored that even wealth and success can't fully shield someone from prejudice. Yet it also showcased her unwavering resolve to speak up, not just for herself, but for what's right. For Harriet Barnes, that one impulsive act of belittling the very owner of the plane she served led to her downfall and her rebirth through self-reflection and change. Their lives touched at 30,000 feet, sparking lessons in humility, empathy, and the power of taking a stand. If you found inspiration in this story, if it reminded you that we should never judge a book by its cover, then please like this video, share it with friends who need a spark of hope, and subscribe for more stories that illuminate the human heart. Your support helps keep these transformative tales soaring. Thank you for watching.